Hi there people, it's Pyxcore, and wars, am I right? Well, today we're going to be taking a crash course in wars. And you can't beat the classics, which is why we're starting with World War I, otherwise known as the Great War. And who started it? Atari 2600, this is just the console wars, isn't it? Video game consoles. You take your nearest game, pop it into your closest console, but this Wii game won't work because it's a PlayStation and it's not plugged in. Sure, you can buy Super Mario Odyssey if you only had an Xbox, but you'd be an idiot for doing so. These games have to run on specific hardware to work. More often than not, that hardware is a console or a PC if you're a lunatic like me. But consoles are the way that many people choose to waste their time, and how many people waste their time arguing about whose disc box is better. Ever since the first consoles, video game companies have been fighting for the top spot in the market. And we start things off with the second generation of video game consoles because I forgot how to count. See, the first generation didn't really have home consoles in the modern sense of the term, so we're starting off with the second generation. And this generation was home to Fairchild Channel F, Intellivision, ColecoVision, Magnavox Odyssey 2, a sequel to the first ever home console, and the Atari 2600. And it's no question who the winner of this generation was. It was the Atari 2600. And I know, I made an episode about how I didn't really care for the system, so before I can talk about why it won, I have to say my channel got hacked, guys, I swear it wasn't me. The main reason this console won was because it had the best games in marketing. I mean, you don't see an Intellivision commercial guy on Know Your Meme, you see Atari commercial guy. And while Atari's games ranged from pretty good to burying a desert levels of quality, at least it had recognizable games. The Intellivision and ColecoVision are more obscure, and if you say Fairchild Channel F to anyone, they'll tell you to watch your language. The Atari 2600 had games like Pitfall, Pitfall 2, Space Invaders, Breakout, Pong. Why does this game keep haunting me? Yeah, so Atari won this one by a landslide. Moving on to the third generation of consoles, we have Atari Just Go Home. This was long after the 2600 was starting to die out, and what did Atari do? Released the 5200, which basically just had the exact same games as the 2600. But there were two companies who made their home console debut in this generation. Sega with the Master System and Nintendo with the Nintendo Entertainment System. And which of these? I couldn't even finish that sentence. Of course Nintendo won. Nintendo won, and it's obvious why. This system just made sense. It looked like a VCR and everyone had one of those. And the controller. Oh, the controller. It may have had the sharp edges, but it is still one of the most iconic video game controllers ever. It also pioneered the D-pad, which became a staple on literally every controller ever. They even later redesigned the controller along with the console. The NES Top Loader, as it was nicknamed, loaded cartridges on the top. The controller was called the dog bone because it was in the shape of a dog bone. The only issue is I have to break my fingers in order to get my hands on the buttons correctly. But this system had some of the most iconic games ever. Super Mario Bros., Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Mega Man, Final Fantasy, Dr. Mario, Excitebike, Kid Icarus, Tetris. All were either started or popularized on the NES. There's a reason your grandpa calls anything video game related a Nintendo. Nintendo! That is a fridge. I think it's a good time to say that I'm not going to be talking about handhelds for the most part. I say this because Dr. Mario and Tetris both got versions on the Game Boy which sold better than their NES counterparts. So yes, the NES won this generation, but the Master System had Bubble Bobble. The Master System was far behind the Nintendo Entertainment System. It did, however, innovate in one area. That being boxes. You see, before this, video games were just in cardboard boxes. With the Master System, however, they were in plastic cases. They still looked bad, though. They were basically just graph paper with clip art of what the game was meant to be. This is also where video game companies started pushing how many bits their system had, with this being the 8-bit generation. And no one knew what bits were. Yeah, anyway, I think it's safe to say that Nintendo won this generation. The fourth generation of consoles was started by the Genesis, made by the creators of the Bubble Bobble players, Sega. The Master System was a puny system, there was no question about that. But Sega really stepped it up with the Genesis, or the Mega Drive in Europe. Now, since this was the first console in this generation, they were basically competing with the NES. So Sega decided to spew all this garbage about how Sega does what Nintendo don't, and blast processing. I mean, yeah, that's technically true, but they were competing against last-gen hardware. Wow, I can run faster than my grandpa, can you believe it? The blast processing marketing got even worse with the release of Sonic the Hedgehog in 1991, because he was fast. This episode, however, is not about him. Anyway, Sega was definitely the best for a few years there, even overtaking Nintendo for a bit. But Nintendo completely outdid Sega, both in terms of specs and sales when they released the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Super Nintendo, or the SNES, or the Super Famicom. Either way, while this system didn't sell as well as the NES, it did sell 40 million units, which is nothing to scoff at. This system also continued several series from the NES and even introduced new ones. Super Mario World, Yoshi's Island, F-Zero, Star Fox, Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, Tetris 2. It's just Tetris. Tetris Attack. It's not Tetris. And thus Nintendo wins again. At this point, Nintendo was a gaming juggernaut and CDs were beginning to become more widely used in video games. I mean, they could store way more information than cartridges and had higher quality graphics and audio. Sega released their own CD add-on for the Genesis named the Sega CD. Real creative, Sega. So it only made sense that Nintendo would release a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. So they started working with Sony to make a CD-ROM add-on for the SNES. But they realized that they weren't getting the best deal, so instead they started working with Sony's competitor at the time, Philips. So together, Nintendo and Philips released the Philips CDI. And how did that go? Well, it sure went. The games on the CDI were so bad, and Sony got all butthurt and released an entire console out of spite. And this is what kickstarted the 5th generation of consoles. Nintendo proceeded to get confused for a year and released the Virtual Boy and finally released the Nintendo 64 in 1996. And you'd think that Nintendo would be innovators like they were for the Nintendo Entertainment System and Super Nintendo and would outsell Sony's PlayStation by a lot. You'd think! You see, Nintendo was still stuck on cartridges, and we talked about why they suck earlier. Meanwhile, Sony's PlayStation and Sega's Saturn consoles were using CDs! I mean, it didn't work out too well for Sega, but it did for Sony! And it was for this reason... Hey, don't interrupt me. And it was for this reason Sony won this generation. Moving on to the 6th generation, Nintendo learned from their mistakes, but only barely. See, Nintendo used discs for this console, but they were optical discs, which were the size of mini DVDs, and Nintendo's reasoning for this is that they were harder to pirate. Haha, not gonna stop me. Well... This was especially stupid because Sony's PlayStation 2 and the newcomer Xbox were both using DVDs. Also, Nintendo made this console a cube after inventing a brand new shape for the Nintendo 64.
Make it a square!
Okay, let's look at the competition. First we have Sega, and oh look at that, I was invited for the funeral. Look, the Sega Dreamcast was a good console, but Sega needed something to save them and the Dreamcast was just not it. After their extreme failure with the Saturn, they had to find a good way to get out of their grave and the Dreamcast just dug the hole even deeper. I mean, sure, it has great games like the Sonic Adventure series and Jet Grind Radio, but this console ended Sega-made systems. The system was released in 1998 and was discontinued just a few years later in 2001. Its games were ported over to other systems. And speaking of other systems, we have Microsoft entering the ring with the Xbox. This was the most powerful system of the generation and yet was still outsold by the PS2. Speaking of which, the PS2, the second ever PlayStation, because it'd be weird if this was the third one. And I wonder what console, I can't even finish that sentence, of course PlayStation 1. I'll be honest, this one was pretty one-sided. Moving on to the 7th generation of consoles, we got rid of this blue idiot and everyone stepped up their game. No pun intended. Nintendo finally sobered up and released the Wii. It was nowhere near the most powerful console on the market at the time, but it won by one thing and one thing only. Motion controls, I guess. Okay, it probably wasn't just one thing, I guess some marketing helped. They marketed the system for the casuals! This is why there are so many games like Wii Play and Wii Chess in Europe flooding this system's library. Because it wasn't made for the hardcore Nintendo fans only, it was made for your great-grandma. Sure, there were your Mario Galaxies and Twilight Princesses, but these games had mandatory motion control and they were way fewer than the casual games. This is why most people don't consider it the winner of this generation. Which it was. Still have to talk about the other consoles. Oh, alright. The Xbox 360 was Microsoft's system this generation. And 360? Really, Microsoft? Are you just allergic to the number 2? No, I gotta get out of here! And this system was almost immediately successful. This is also when everyone except for Nintendo was switching to HDMI, so that was one of the main selling points. But this console was the most powerful this generation, which it's Microsoft. Why wouldn't it be? These guys make computers. But then we get to the PS3 and this price tag is a joke. $600 for a 60GB PS3. There was a 20GB model that cost $500, but even that was steep for the time. For a while there, the Xbox 360 was winning the war this generation. But after Sony released the PS3 Slim and Super Slim models and dropped the price of the original, they ended up selling more than the Xbox 360 and barely won. It may have been by a close margin, but it was Sony who came out on top of this one. You know, Xbox systems have historically sold less than PlayStation consoles despite being more powerful. It doesn't make any sense. Well, the reason for them selling less than PlayStation this time does make sense because for some reason Microsoft announced that the Xbox One would require internet and wouldn't be able to play used games. Microsoft effectively killed their console before you could buy it. I know that nowadays a lot of games require internet, but an entire console? And to add even more salt and chemical burns to the self-inflicted wound, Sony put a focus on used games for their announcement for the PS4. Not only this, but the PS4 launched at $400. How much did the Xbox One launch at? $500! Microsoft eventually went back on this, allowing the system to play used games and not making it require internet, and released the Xbox One S, which was a cheaper, better version of the Xbox One. This was also the generation where system redesigns began to get more prevalent. I mean, sure, they existed before, but do you really want to be seen playing a Super Nintendo Model 2? I'd say Nintendo was always the most prevalent with redesigns, with the NES Top Loader, SNES Model 2, Wii RVL 101, and Wii Mini. And Sony made redesigns of the PS1, 2, and 3, and Xbox had made a redesign of the 360 after a certain catastrophe. But the 8th generation of consoles is where companies really went all in on redesigns. Xbox had the original model, the S and the X, and PlayStation had the original model Slim and Pro. Hey, what's that on my computer screen? Oh, it's a failure! I guess I gotta talk about this thing. The Wii U released in 2012, which was a year before everyone else's offerings. You'd think that'd give it a head start to win this generation. You'd think!
You know, being successful was great, but I think I prefer failure.
So, what did Nintendo do wrong this time? Well, a lot of things. First, when they went to announce the console, they didn't really announce the console. They were basically announcing the Wii U gamepad with a side of Wii U console. And even so, they didn't even call it the Wii U gamepad, they just referred to it as a new controller. And the system wasn't even shown front and center, it was barely shown. And when it was shown, it was in the corner of the room! Oh, and what did they choose to show off their brand new console with? Maybe Super Mario Maker or Splatoon even. No, those games were released 2 years after the system launch. Instead, they decided to show the Wii U playing New Super Mario Bros. U, which looks almost exactly like Super Mario Bros. Wii. And Nintendo barely marketed the Wii U, and when they did, it was a little thing I like to call bad.
We'll make this quick.
Family time's dropping fast, people.
I mean, I had to learn about the system through YouTube, and when I did, I really wanted one. I mean, I never got one, but I wanted one. That makes me and one other person on the planet who liked the Wii U. And the gamepad wasn't really utilized very well in many games. I mean, it made split-screen games better, and there were a few cool uses here and there, but nothing too special. It was also less powerful than the PS4 and Xbox One, and the black model cost the same amount as the PS4. I mean, this was Nintendo's first console with HDMI, but was that really going to save it at this point? Oh wow, this casket's so nice, maybe the corpse will come back to life. Well, now that I've talked about that wet fart of a system, I can now say for certain... And that's basically it. I can't talk about the current generation of consoles because they're still selling. Maybe I will in the future after like 4 more generations of consoles, but with how long the Switch has lasted... Hi there, YouTube. It's Pyxcore. Now, I know I didn't really talk about games here, so here's what you need to know. Nintendo mainly focuses on more kid-friendly first-party exclusives. PlayStation is mostly T and M rated third-party exclusives and third-party multi-platform games as well. Although a lot of E-rated games do come out for the systems, and Xbox is mainly T and M rated first-party exclusives, if by exclusives you mean a joke. See, since the Xbox One era, Microsoft has been putting all of their Xbox exclusives onto PC through Xbox Game Pass. And that's all you need to know. Great, now I can talk about the actual wars, and what better place to start than World War I, otherwise known as the Great War. And who started it? Netflix, you've got to be joking me.